Hello, everyone, and welcome to our June live Q&A. Evan and I are going to be covering developing great oil sampling and handling techniques. My name is Heather Versillo. I've been with TestOil for a little over 10 years now in a variety of technical roles. And I'm going to allow Evan to introduce himself as well, and then we'll hop to it.
All right, I'm Evan Zabowski, and I am the Senior Technical Advisor here at TestOil. And my main responsibilities are providing training to a lot of our customers.
Yep. So Evan's a great wealth of knowledge. And, while we're talking about oil sampling and handling techniques, since we're live, if you do happen to have any questions at all about lubrication, oil analysis, we'd be happy to answer those as well. This is being recorded at the moment. So once this live event ends, we'll be posting this on a variety of our social channels, and it's going to live infinitely on our YouTube channel if you want to review it later on or send it out to some other people. With that being said, though, this is only about 30 minutes, and we like to stick to that time. So without further ado, Evan, I did get a few questions before the event. So I'm going to go ahead and start with those. And the first one I have, I think, is the most apropos given our event. Because I had someone ask, why is oil sampling and handling technique important?
Well, that's an easy answer at first. It's, as we always say about data, garbage in is garbage out. So we need to have a proper technique to ensure good data, and that really good data gives us, a good foundation to begin the interpretation, which then leads to decent corrective actions, and ultimately the performance of the whole program can hinge on that. So if we get this step wrong, it's not easy to make it right later.
Very, very true. That's something we've seen routinely. An example, we've had instances in which our customers, maybe the person that routinely pulls the oil sample is out on vacation and they have someone come in to replace him for a moment. And that person grabs a sample from a different port or the drain port potentially. And, we start to get different data than is what is in the trend. And it makes recommendations and determining your maintenance actions a little bit difficult once you don't know where that history is coming from anymore and where you're going. So, all right, our second question that we did receive was, and this comes along the lines of what I just mentioned, but should the same person pull the oil samples every time?
Well, that's a good idea to a point, but like you just said, right? What happens if they're not there that day? What happens if they're, out on vacation, or it's not their shift, or however it works out? So the general recommendation is to have as few as people as possible pull your oil samples. That may need to be a team of, 2 or more people just to have coverage throughout, every workday. But yeah, try and minimize how many different people there are. If you have, literally a different person each and every time, there's a good chance that some of those samples will come back with some, weird looking data, just because they may have picked a different location. They may have not used the same procedure or tools. And it can add noise to the data, making the interpretation a little bit more iffy.
Right. Very, very true. So our next question that we received in was from someone wondering about, they have several pieces of equipment that they literally cannot sample while they're running. So is it worthwhile to pull a sample while the equipment is cold?
It's very inadvisable to pull samples when they're cold, just because there's a lot of things that can happen. Namely, particulate may settle out and water may condense. And depending on your sample location, that can either skew to lower values than are actually representative of the real system, or they could skew to higher values. So if you can't sample due to, whatever safety, logistics concerns there are while it's running, then the best practice would be immediately after it's been shut down, or whenever it's safest to approach that piece of equipment after shutdown, right? Some things operate so hot you can't get in there under normal circumstances, but the idea is you'd like the oil to still be warm when you go in. So if you have to wait half an hour, whatever it might be, that's fine. But yeah, leaving it all the way till it's cold is inadvisable.
Right. That's a good point. But yeah, there are times like with this person that you cannot do it at the time you'd like to. So moving on to our next question there. Uh, this is kind of a loaded one because it depends a bit, but they were asking, where is the best place to pull a sample? And when it comes to filters, does it matter if I pull a sample before or after the filter?
Yeah, that's definitely a loaded question because there's a lot
Yes.
of variables there. But simple answer is when you're taking a sample, look for the location that is closest to whatever you're concerned about, right? Which is usually the machine parts that move and interact with each other. So you want to be as close to those or just downstream from them as is practical. Again, sometimes logistics dictate that immediately downstream or accessing that cavity within the machine is not practical, not safe. So if you have to move yourself a little bit away from it, go downstream of it where the oil is going to flow. But the big question about before or after the filters, it's one of those things that's kind of an interesting point because industry best practices always say, make sure you sample before the filter because the concern is that the filter is going to be removing material that you would otherwise see in oil analysis. But the practical argument is your oil is constantly circulating through said filter. So really the only difference between before and after the filter is however much wear debris or ingress particulate may occur in a single pass, in a single time frame between the oil going from the machine parts to the filter and then circulating through the system again. So it's not the end of the world to sample after a filter. It's just best practice to consider sampling before the filter. And funnily enough, filter housings often provide good sample locations because upstream of the filter, you usually have some sort of connection, whether it's for a differential pressure gauge or a vent or something like that, that makes a pretty decent sample point just because the hardware already exists, but also you've got back pressure and turbulence, which give you a nice representative sample.
That's very true. That's a really good question about filters, and I know it's one we get quite often in general. And while we are talking about oil sampling and handling, one thing I wanted to throw up here on the screen for people is we have an oil book or ebook on oil sampling best practices. It's a free download if anyone's interested, so I'll leave that up for a little bit while we talk about our next question. So the next one I received was, I've heard that you should pull a sample from the bottom of reservoirs. Is this actually a good practice?
Generally, no. One of the things I always say about sampling from the bottom of a reservoir, especially when we talk about large reservoirs, big sumps, is no matter how well you flush that sample point, no matter how good the hardware is, all you're getting a look at is what the bottom of your reservoir looks like. And by design, reservoirs are meant to be the garbage pits. They're meant to be where the big particulate settles out, where the free water will fall. So unless you really need to see that kind of information, generally you try and avoid sampling from a reservoir, particularly from the bottom of a reservoir. It's not to say you can't sample there, and like I said, you can't find value in it. But generally speaking, if you're sampling from a reservoir, the idea is to go somewhere near the middle, meaning top to bottom. You're not near the top, you're not near the bottom, you're somewhere in the middle, and you're away from the sides. So again, we mean middle, kind of side to side. And your preference is at the return end, not the supply end. You want where the oil's coming into the reservoir before it has a chance to settle out any particulate, any water content, as it travels down to the supply end of the reservoir. So yeah, avoid the drain if you can.
If someone were to sample, though, from the reservoir, what type of value do you think they would get out of that sample?
Well, one of the things we always say about any sampling really is consistency. And there's three consistencies that we look for. One is location, another one is procedure, and another one is frequency. And so if you do sample from a reservoir and you are sampling always from that same relative spot in the reservoir, that is a consistency. That can be trended. You can see changes to the system. So it is a reasonable sample point. If you can be further upstream, like I said, closer to the machine parts that are actually interacting with each other, that is generally better because once oil enters a reservoir, it's going to dilute with whatever other oil is already there. So reservoirs can be a bit of a lagging indicator to a significant change in your system's performance or contamination levels. But if you are always sampling from there, you are hitting that first consistency and you will be able to trend it. You will be able to see some changes. They just might be a little bit slower.
Okay. That is good to understand and know, I think, for people, because in the event where that is their only sample spot, they get a feeling for what type of value they can expect from that point. So one of our next questions we've received, this is something we talk about quite a bit, but they were wondering what type of training should someone have before they begin pulling samples?
Funnily enough, I always recommend that it's very minimal training that's required. The whole point of sampling is that it should be simple. There should be very few steps involved. And the reason for this is the more complicated and the more technical it is to try and pull a sample, the greater chance there is that somebody could make a mistake or take a shortcut and alter the results. And like I said, that's kind of the second consistency that we're looking at, is a consistent procedure.
Mm-hmm.
So, following the KISS principle of keep it simple, you should be able to have a fairly simple sampling procedure. And the one we put out there, the one that's in the ebook that we recommend, is 5 steps. It's 5 words. It's 5 syllables. And really, in order, they are wipe, flush, fill, cap, and send. You wipe the sample port before you manipulate it, because anything that may fall into the bottle will show up on the report. You flush the sample point so that you get live circulating hot oil coming out of it before you choose to put that in the bottle. You fill the bottle to make sure that you give us enough sample to get all the testing you need performed, and then cap it immediately to prevent any contamination from entering the bottle. And if you haven't done it at that point yet, this is the best time to take a marker or a sticker or the labels that we provide and label the sample bottle so you don't mix it up with any other ones.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, send it in right away. It's a very common fault in an oil analysis program to get most of the steps right and then sit on the samples, waiting to accumulate a full box. And, people are always concerned about, well, how fast will I get my results? And, at TestOil, we are same day, meaning the day it arrives is the day the report goes out. So we're not generally going to be much of a holdup to the whole process, but shipping can be a concern for some people. So, of course, in today's world with every kind of carrier out there, overnight shipping is a very economical reality. So we always say to people, even if you only have a couple, throw them in the bag, send them in right away. You'll get your reports back. So given that those are the 5 steps, like I said, they are simple. They shouldn't take a lot of training. There's no special technique for how to open a valve or how to open a sample bottle or even how to hold the bottle while you're filling it.
Mm-hmm.
The point is, keep it simple. You will get consistent results, and that will increase the value of your program.
Very true. All right. And I see we have a couple questions that just came in. So this first one I'm going to show from Roger. And this is a really good question. So should you rinse sample bottles? If so, how much?
So it's a good idea to flush the sample point when you take a sample anyways. And my logic is, if you're going to be flushing some oil that you're just going to be dumping out, why not run that through the sample bottle as well? This will help rinse the bottle of any particular contaminants that may have entered the bottle after you open the cap. So generally speaking, my practice, and I'm not saying this is what everyone needs to do, but when I'm sampling, I always fill the sample bottle 3 times, dump it out 3 times, and then the 4th time is the bottle that I keep. And it's not to say that you need to do it exactly 3 times, but my point is that that's my consistency.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter what volume the system is. I will take 3 bottles full and dump them out. And by the time I take that 4th bottle, that's the one that I keep. And ultimately, you've taken out about a pint of oil from the system. So most systems can tolerate that kind of loss without needing to be topped up again. In some cases, you may be forced to take out less, or maybe forced to add oil after you've pulled your sample to make up any shortcomings. But generally speaking, we recommend that all the sampling hardware be flushed. So that's the sample point, any
Mm-hmm.
sample tubing that you may use, just in case you are using a sampling pump to pull that sample. But the logic is, why not also through the sample bottle itself, just in case there's concern that after you've removed the cap, something may have entered the bottle, just airborne contamination. I mean, plastic bottles are a bit staticky,
Mm-hmm.
so that's always a concern, and that's how you alleviate it.
Right. Very true. And let's see, we also had a question here from Kevin, so I'll throw that on the screen as well. He asked, in an injection molding machine, a dip tube sample was collected, no drain port or a mini mesh sample port. The results were normal. How dependable are these reports?
Well, as long as that dip tube sample was taken, from a reasonable part of the reservoir, like I said, closer to the return side than the supply side, there's not
Mhm.
much worry that you're not seeing what's going on, what changes may be occurring. But as I said before, it could be a bit of a lagging indicator that maybe you're not seeing as much change as is actually happening through the rest of the system. But as long as you always sample from that particular location with that technique, there's still good value to that data, and you will still see when things change.
Perfect. And Kevin, hopefully that answered your question. And actually, one of the questions I had emailed ahead of time talks a little bit about ports, like Kevin mentioned. And they were asking, what type of sampling ports or valves do you recommend, Evan?
So there's about 3 different ones, depending on the configuration of the machine, that I
Mhm.
recommend the most. And first and foremost is a mini mesh style sample port. And that's just one that has a threaded dust cap, has a thread on adapter, so it's easy to control the flow. But it's basically just a quick connect way of pulling samples from a system. Now they can operate under pressure, under no pressure, and even under a slight vacuum. And they work reasonably well, and they come in a variety of sizes and shapes and all that kind of good stuff. So if possible, I do recommend people, install mini mesh style sampling valves on most of their sample ports. But there are 2 others that I recommend depending on the configuration. And one is a 3D sight glass version that you can upgrade your existing sight glasses to having a 3D sight glass, which makes it better for checking your level. But through the center of the sight glass is a pitot tube connected to, again, a mini mesh style fitting. And then the third one is usually one to replace quarter turn breathers. This is one with a manifold for quick connects to fill and drain your system. It has an upgraded breather, so it protects your system better, and again has a pitot tube going into the system.
Hmm.
So as you can see, every one of these typically has some sort of mini mesh style connection to it, and that would be the ones I would recommend the most. But the one thing I will always qualify that statement with: a quarter turn ball valve works just as well. It might require a bit more flushing every time you use it, and you might be a bit more diligent wiping it before you first flush it. But really, the idea is, again, keep it simple, keep it consistent. If you can have all your sampling valves look about the same, have
Hmm.
about the same configuration, it goes a long way to ensuring people always pull the samples from the right location and not look to any other particular opening. So I always recommend, if people are going to make upgrades, try and minimize the number of different pieces of hardware you're going to have out there in the plant so that people recognize them on site. And of course, we generally recommend that you label them. And one of the best ways to label them is we have our own asset link labels that you can use with your smartphone type device and just scan the sample point with that tag. And you're automatically into our system, and you can pull your sample, and it's already logged and registered. It really
Hmm.
simplifies a bunch of the steps and avoids having to handwrite out in the field, under oily, dirty conditions.
Right, right. I think one of the nice parts about it too is that if there is a lubricant type change or some other information, you can log that right in the app on your phone and it automatically changes in the database. So you don't have to worry about information getting mixed up there. Um, and it kind of sounds like from what you were saying that it comes back to technique a little bit still with ensuring that you're flushing no matter what type of port or valve you're using, making sure you're wiping clean so as to minimize any particulates around or on the port from getting into the oil sample, making its way to the laboratory, right?
Yeah, and that's why, like I said, I like the mini mesh style, just because they have a thread-on dust cap that keeps the sample port protected. It minimizes how much wiping and flushing is truly necessary. A quarter turn ball valve, like I said, works just fine, but might require a bit more wiping, might require a bit more flushing to ensure that you're not going to get a chunk of something that's accumulated on the outside since the
Mm-hmm.
last time you sampled it.
Very true. All right. And let's see. One of our next questions that we received was, my team doesn't have time to pull samples from all equipment. What do you consider to be the most critical pieces of equipment to sample?
Well, there's different criticality matrices you can use to determine this, but basically the key ones is it actually critical to operations?
Hmm.
That's always on the top of your list. If it shuts down your operation, your plant, then it's something that must be sampled. But other considerations are safety, expense. Um, there's quite a few that relate to the environment or operating conditions. But you can try and minimize your list to the key ones by sort of evaluating what are the most important criteria to consider if it's worth sampling. Because
Hmm.
there are definitely some things out there that are either very small volume or very inexpensive or have scheduled oil changes that are generally so short and aggressive that there's not a lot of value or benefit to pulling samples from every single lubricated piece of equipment. And we often say that we'd much rather see you take your top 10 pieces of equipment and do a really vigorous test slate on those pieces of equipment every time you pull a sample than simply do a routine test package on 100 different pieces of equipment. Right? It's just the
Right.
same budget essentially, but more bang for your buck by focusing on those key pieces of equipment that are most critical or most expensive to the
Hmm.
overall value of your operations.
Yeah, and we want to use the Pareto principle for this, right? So,
Exactly. There's, only so many pieces of equipment, the 20% that we refer to in the Pareto principle that could account for 80% of our headaches or problems or maintenance downtime. So yeah, we focus on those and we get, like I said, the best value for the program, the, biggest return on an investment that those other 80% generally only yield 20% of your headaches and issues.
hmm, exactly. So it looks like we have about 8 minutes left with our time. I do have a couple more questions that had come in, and so we'll try to get through these. So next one was, I read an article that stated UV light can degrade oil samples. If the samples are collected and put in a cardboard box, how long can they sit before I can't receive an accurate analysis?
Well, to qualify the statement about UV light, it only affects some testing. In particular, that's been noted for the MPC test, membrane patch
Hmm.
colorimetry, used to detect insolubles in an effort to predict varnish. But the second part of the question, as long as you store them properly, right, then you're not concerned about UV effects. And I always think it's interesting when people say, "Well, how long can a sample sit before the data is not valid?" And I always think, well, you shouldn't be asking that kind of question. You should be sending the samples in right away. But no, if they sit for a few weeks, that's no big deal. I mean, even if they sat for a few months, arguably the data wouldn't be that different. The problem is that you're now waiting 6 months for a sample result, and things might have gotten significantly worse, and you wouldn't have any better idea what's going on. So
Right. And some
don't
of my
be too concerned
impression is
about
that,
concerns, but do
sorry,
try and be prompt sending samples in, right?
right.
Like I said, I don't like when people say, well, how long can I wait? It's like there shouldn't be a question of waiting. Send them in, quickly.
Hmm. And it seems like, too, my impression has been, and from data that I've seen in the laboratory here, is that you want to, if they're sitting, I know sometimes that needs to happen, you want to ensure that they're in a good environment to be sitting. And that is part of what you're going to be looking at as well.
Yeah, make sure the caps are on tight.
Hmm.
Put them in a box or a bag so they're away from light, away from other heat sources too. You don't want any cycling of temperature occurring because there could be minor degradation that may happen while it's still in the bottle. There could be, breathing in the bottle that could bring in outside contaminants or moisture. So
Right.
treat the sample as you would treat your system, right?
Hmm.
Keep it sealed, keep it, closed off from all things. But yeah,
Clean,
I
cool, and
understand there
dry.
are circumstances where people do have to sit on a sample for a few days. That's not a concern. A few weeks, like I said, not even a concern. If once it starts being a few months, I said you have to consider how old that data is now. Even if the data is
Hmm.
unaffected, it's old data.
Right. Uh, so let's see. We did have another question come in from Kevin again. And let me throw that up here. So he asked, do you recommend using a sealable bag oil sampling method?
Yeah, if you're dealing with a really, really contaminated environment, it could just be something that's normal to everyday operations, or it could be something that's unique to the time frame that you're taking the samples in. Right? Maybe you have to go outside on a particularly windy day, or it's actually raining. Then yeah, using the sealed bag method of taking your bottle with the cap off, placing it inside of a sealed, Ziploc style sandwich bag, carrying that out into the field, you can actually then thread your bottle onto your vacuum pump. And as you do so, if the tubing's been installed into the pump correctly, where the tubing protrudes through the bottom of the pump, it will puncture the bag as you screw the bottle onto the pump. You can now pull your sample without the bottle ever having seen, the environmental conditions. And after you fill the sample bottle up, you can unscrew the bag from the pump and then fish the lid up to the top of the bag, which I know sounds like it might be difficult and requires finesse with the fingers, but actually it's quite simple. And some people have commented that it's such a good idea that even if they're not using the sealed bag technique to avert contamination, they like the sealed bag technique because they never have to worry about where to put the sample cap. It's always in the bag, right? But
Right.
yeah, the sealed bag technique is definitely a good idea, like I said, when there is adverse conditions. And it could be something as simple as maybe where you operate in your plant where that particular sample is being pulled, there's a nearby steam leak, and you just know there's a lot of humidity in the atmosphere. This will make sure that the oil going into the sample bottle is the oil from the system and doesn't contain any outside ambient contaminants like particles or moisture.
Perfect. So I also threw Evan's email and my email up there on the screen. So if you have questions after the fact, or if you're watching a recording of this, please feel free to get in touch with us. And that being said, we have 3 minutes left, and I do have one more question that I'd received ahead of time. So, and this final one's a little bit of a big one. It's a culture question more than anything else. But they asked, how can I help my team realize that pulling oil samples is not a low-level job at the plant?
Well, one of the best ways to sort of change that thinking, to change that culture, is to be inclusive, right? To not just ask people to take samples and then have them, submit them to you. Show them the results when they come in. Show them the interpretation that you've come up with based on those results to help involve them in the whole process. Once they see how important those samples are, and one of the things you have to be cautious on is, statistically, we say somewhere around 95% of your samples should come back normal, right? Typically, we want them to come back normal. That means we're doing everything right.
Right.
So it's not going to be, too many of your samples that are going to indicate a problem, that are going to lead to a corrective action that you could therefore show actually, implemented some kind of change. But what you want them to see is that the system works, the program works, it's there for a reason. So my short answer is involvement, right? They're going to view it as a low-level task if all you do is take the samples from them and then send them out to go get more. They'll just see them as like, a general errand. Whereas if they're actually involved in the whole process, they will see the value to it eventually. Maybe not right away, because like I said, hopefully everyone wants their samples to come back normal and not show them too many problems. But when you do get one that is an alarm, you can involve them in all those next steps and just show them how that sample helped identify a problem before it became really severe and caused, a bigger headache.
Right. That's very true. So with that, let me check our comments real quick. We don't have any other live questions at the moment. So with that, we are having these live Q&As monthly. So Evan and I will be back live on July 19th at 12:30 p.m. Eastern. And next month, we are going to be covering coolant analysis. So if you do happen to have any questions, please join us, become part of the conversation. Feel free to throw your 2 cents in as well. But otherwise, Evan, I really appreciate your time and you sharing your knowledge with everyone. And thanks to everyone that participated. And I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you.
Take care.